Good afternoon. Welcome to the 12th edition of China Watcher, ISPI's annual conference on China. The scope of this event is to better understand China from a political and economic point of view. We are doing that following the step of Professor Maria Weber, who is the Italian pioneer of watching China not only as a cultural powerhouse, but also as an emerging power and a leading economy. Such a view is quite important, especially for what we are doing today and for the issues we will be discussing today. That is, China as a systemic rival in the 21st century. We want to analyze these topics, China a systemic rival in the 21st century, not only in the term of what are the implications for considering China like that, but also how this relationship, how the relationship with China will be affected accordingly. We'll focus first on a strategic dimension with terrific guests like Professor Kerry Brown from Lao China Institute, the King's College, Professor Susan Thornton from Yale Law School, and Professor Wang Huiyao from the Center for China and Globalization. They will be moderated by my colleague Giulia Sciorati, my colleague here at ISPI and research fellow at the University of Trento. After that will be a second panel, and after having addressed the strategic landscape, we will focus on the economic realm. And I will be honored to be the moderator of a great panel with Professor Alicia Garcia Herrero from Bruegel and Natixis, Professor Joshua Meltzer from Brookings Institute, and Professor Xiumin Qi from the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences and the Shanghai Institute for European Studies. But actually, before starting, we have to say that this conference is possible only thanks to the support of the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. For this reason, I'm glad to give the floor to Giuliana Del Papa, head of the Policy Planning Unit of the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. Please, Giuliana Del Papa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, ISPI, for organizing this event, for inviting us. As head of the Italian Policy Planning Union at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, we regard initiatives like this as extremely helpful, since they are characterized by high standards of scientific quality and can allow diplomacy to work smoothly and carry out its mission in a more effective way. More broadly, I would say that we are fully aware that promoting a better understanding of international dynamics and of the implication of an evolving reality among the wider public is essential. In nowadays world, foreign policy and diplomacy need more than ever, more than in the past, to lean onto a solid base of public consensus, which in turn needs to stem from the availability of accountable information. So events like this one have the potential to encourage a serious and fact-based discussion within the public opinion, and represent, for that reason, a valuable contribution to prevent false and misleading information, since we have, I think, all witnessed how harmful the so-called infodemic can be for our societies. Analysis carried out by the expert scholar, focusing on specific fields of study with continuity, are especially insightful and are of great help for us to remain firmly focused, firmly centered around those structural factors whose role will deeply affect next year's and or even decades, and avoid being dragged into day-to-day work and be fall prey in a way to short-term vision. The increased attention towards communication and the positive engagement of the citizens is one of the reasons why this ministry has created a new Director General for Public Diplomacy and Cultural Diplomacy. Although daily news about, of course, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine reminds us that we're actually living in times of hard power, it would be maybe not convenient to underestimate the relevance of soft power, a concept that not by chance is being embraced in a quite vigorous way by China, especially in its relationship with developing countries. Let me just have a few remarks on the subject of this conference. The main theme, it is of course evident that the strategic rivalry between the US and China has been deepening in virtually every realm, ideological, political, cultural, economic, military, and it has done so at an accelerating pace in the last few years. Both Beijing's growth and the distance between the Chinese political institutional nature and values and the ones of our liberal democracies pose an increasing threat to the current balance of power. Beijing's growing assertiveness, power, and influence on a global scale, including multilateral organizations and in several theaters, in its region and beyond, but also in space and cyberspace, are thus perceived in Washington, in many places in the West, as having the potential to undermine the very foundations of the existing rule-based international order. Secretary of State Blinken has put it in its recent outlining of the new US policy towards China. China is not only the only country, it's the only country with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the means to do that. China's ambiguously neutral stance vis-a-vis Russia's aggression to Ukraine, which has been displaced by its refusal to condemn and isolate Moscow, has been further eroding trust and widening the gap between Beijing and the West. These dynamics, of course, are affecting the trajectory of EU-China relationship as well. As EU leaders made it clear to President Xi Jinping and the Chinese Premier during the EU-China summit last April, there is a strong expectation for China to play a more constructive role regarding the Ukraine crisis, distancing itself from the reputational and material costs that Moscow has to pay for its actions. While the EU and Italy, of course, are firm on this point, we are, of course, at the same time chastening unfair trade practices and violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms. But we also see wisdom in maintaining an approach to relationship with China that is principled, but also balanced and pragmatic. We should not give hardliners in China any excuse to nurture a dangerous and an expedient sense of encirclement, or the perception of being the target of constant criticism. We believe in the importance of maintaining adequate spaces for collaboration and dialogue with Beijing, including in areas where our positions are divergent, as in the case of our approach to human rights. We believe, in a few words, in the importance of keeping China engaged, underlining the idea of inclusivity, also in our approach to the Indo-Pacific. China remains an important partner whose prosperity is important for its region, for our economy, and for the whole world, and whose collaboration is key in facing global challenges, climate change, global health, economic growth. So the Sino-US rivalry represents the main foreign policy channels of this century, and it relies primarily, of course, on the perception and decisions of policymakers in Washington and in Beijing. But others can play a constructive role, starting from the EU, and of course, Italy is part of it. China is part of the international system and globalization. Thanks to this framework, it has been able to lift millions of people out of poverty. In a few words, it has benefited from within, and we believe that this has to be a moderating factor, even in such a critical moment as the one we're going through. So thank you very much. I will close here. I'm very looking forward to listen to you and to all of the experts convened today. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Dr. Giulia Del Papa, Head of the Policy Planning Unit at the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. We do hope that today's discussion might be helpful for your activity and as well as ISPI's research on China and on Asia. So I think now it's time to start. So I will leave the floor to Giulia Sciorati, Dr. Giulia Sciorati from ISPI, University of Trento. Giulia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Filippo, and welcome and thank you to the speakers for being here with us this afternoon. I'm looking forward to the debate at such a critical juncture in our history, and line that perhaps we've heard too much during the last 3 years. To kick us off, just let me echo partially what Giuliana Del Papa just said, but I just wanted to point out that 4 months after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China's role and position in the conflict have remained central in public debates. Observers all around the world have presented China as a potential mediator in the war, an ambiguous rather than a responsible power, and at times even Russia's military supporter. However, fully grasping the country's stance over the war in Ukraine remains incredibly complex. Indeed, China has not voted against the UN resolution condemning the Russian invasion, preferring to abstain, in line with an approach adopted at other times in the country's recent history. Better to unfold the questions surrounding China's current international position, I'm turning to the three scholars in this panel with a first broad question. In your opinion, in which way has the war in Ukraine primarily affected relations between China, Europe, and the United States? I kindly ask, as I already mentioned before, that you stay within a 5-7 minutes with your time frame with your answers. And I also just want to stress and invite the audience to start typing their questions to the audience, to the speakers, by commenting on ISPI's social media streaming of the conference, either on Facebook or YouTube. Professor Wang, I would like to start with you. How does China interpret the war and its impact on its international role?
Okay, thank you, Julia, and thank ISPI for the invitation, and also great to see my honored panelists as well. I think the issue of Ukraine has been really, of course, it's alarming, and it's caught the whole world by surprise. I'm sure, including China as well, and. So nobody wants to see that kind of a situation. Is very sad, it's very unfortunate, and it's very terrifying as well. I think China's position has been quite clear. Basically, it supports Ukraine for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that China has mentioned many times. I also noticed that China Defense Minister actually. Mr. Wei Fenghe said yesterday at the Shangri-La Dialogue that China does not provide any assistance to the Russian on this Ukraine war, and China has continuously denied any involvement or support on that. So that means that, however, China does hold the different views is on the sanction. That is really China has hold a different view, because China believes the sanction will not only hurt Ukraine, but also the world, basically. And also China doesn't want to see that, because 70% of Chinese energy depends on the import. And this war has already driven up the energy cost very high. That could cost China billions, if not trillions. And also food prices and food crisis are happening. So all those things, there's a lot of damage to the world economy, and China certainly doesn't want to see that. I think the lesson we can draw from this Ukraine-Russian war is that territorial integrity and sovereignty will be really respected, and then that has been a cornerstone of the post-Second World Order, and that is really needs to be strengthened and needs to be really upheld. And the same is true for Ukraine, and same is true for China, and same is true for Taiwan. So I think that is probably one of the lessons we can learn. And the second is that also I think at least from the Chinese perspective, that if we overemphasize security, if we really put too much emphasis on the military and of course expansions of NATO's and things like that, that could backfire. I mean, of course, Russia hasn't done the right thing, but that is also we cannot say that without any political reasons. I think Dr. Kissinger and many former U.S. government officials actually said, this is historically we need to have some. Rethinking of what has happened, what has been led to what happened today. So it's just for the Chinese say it's take two to clap. It's not just one-sided. So we may have to think about that. And finally, I'd like to say we talk about this theme of this discussion is about systemic rival. I mean, so that is really I think it's a Western thinking, but really from Chinese thinking. It doesn't really pursue a rivalry of any kind, and we don't want to contain or confront with anybody. I'm glad to see that Secretary Blinken has been talking about he doesn't want to contain China or conflict with China, and I can see he's actually changing a bit of that now. In his Alaska, he was talking about confrontation. Now he was. I don't see that word anymore. But also again even on alliance, but. We really hope to see we have more economic alliance rather than a security alliance. So this is really going to be very, very helpful. Let's work on economic incentives. I'm glad to see the WTO ministerial meeting is happening now, and let's talk about that. We really hope that U.S. can come back to CPTPP. We can talk about this, economic issues. And even for the IPEF, if it's really economic oriented, why not China cannot be part of that? We hope to be actively engage on that, so let's have more dialogues and discussions on that. And finally, I think as far as whether it's a democracy or autocracy, it's really, I think the world has become so diversified, and we need to give a bit more historical looking, not only to the past, but also to the future, that we may give countries like China a bit more time to prove itself. It's going to be beneficial. Its economy is going to contribute to the world GDP growth and lift hundreds of millions of poverty. Not only good for China, but also for the world, and support global trade and value chain. So let's not really think all the things in bad terms. Let's think about maybe a more positive thing. But given China has a unique history, culture, as Professor Carol Brown knows well, that really warrants probably some special consideration on China's development models or path. And as long as it's really effective, it's efficient, and it works, we may have to let everybody try their own things out and then see how they can really work and cooperate with the other countries. And that's really the bottom line. The performance, I think, any system, we need to really account to its people. So that's probably the bottom line we have to think about. And let's get convergence as much as possible and maximize the common ground and minimize the difference, rather than taking a rivalry view on that. And I think, China is European largest trade partner. China is also largest trading partner with 130 countries. We have a lot of things to collaborate, and we hope to work with U.S. on climate change, infrastructure, cybersecurity, many issues. So I think there's things can be done, and we have to think in a more positive terms. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. And I'd like to leave the floor to Professor Thornton. From the US, what is the general view on this?
Thank you also to ISPI for having us. As Henry said, it's a great privilege for me to be here with the co-panelists and with such an excellent institution looking at these really important questions. Henry said that the war in Ukraine is something that certainly China did not want to see. I think the same is obviously true for the US, but I think Russia's invasion validates actually several aspects of the new approach to US foreign policy that started under the previous administration of Donald Trump and now has continued and been further kind of elaborated by President Biden. And that is this idea that great power, rivalry, and geopolitics are now the main challenges facing the United States and its partners and allies. This is something that was first put forward by the Trump National Security Strategy in 2018. The second thing, I think, is that it shows that something that the Biden administration has put forward is quite compelling, which is that the future will be a contest between democracies and autocracies, and that there's a potential for an axis between China and Russia in this regard to challenge democratic partners and allies. And that's something that the Biden administration has leaned on very heavily. They had a democracy summit, et cetera. And I guess another Biden administration emphasis has been this idea of closely aligning with allies and beefing up U.S. relations with allies. And I think that the Russian invasion already, it pushes forward what was already a kind of a warming trend in transatlantic relations. It made Europe and the US partnership, I think, even closer, and showed both sides why it is that they need each other, and made it more compelling that they boost this NATO alliance. So I think China seems to have misread a number of things around the Russian invasion. I mean, it dismissed US intelligence before the invasion. I think the show of support for Putin in Beijing right before the invasion was probably a mistake. China then had to defend a position, as Henry has mentioned, that is really contrary to its principles on standing for, territorial integrity kind of above all. And, it also, China appears to have sort of misread the European reaction to the Russian invasion, which, in the April 1st summit between Chinese and European leaders, I think European leaders, at least what I've heard, and Carrie will maybe speak more to this, but felt that China had sort of misread how much of a shock this is in Europe, how it changes European priorities, and how important it is really to European governments. So, the long-term effects, I think, of this are going to be profoundly negative for the international system. But the centerpiece of bipartisan foreign policy under the Biden and Trump administrations has been that, China represents the greatest long-term strategic threat, and therefore the U.S. should prioritize its engagements in Asia. And of course, I think now with this invasion of Ukraine, it has been frustrating for the Biden administration because, first COVID-19 has been the Biden administration's major crisis and priority coming into office. Now the Ukraine war is taking up a lot of focus and energy and actually resources from Washington. And I think, it's the Biden administration will try to keep a focus on the competition with China, but it's not easy for the U.S. administration to deal with multiple challenges at once, especially when one is a burning crisis that's in the headlines every day, and that is really not the character of the China challenge, which everyone has said is a more long-term challenge, as we heard from Juliana Del Papa earlier. So I think, some in the U.S. are saying that the U.S. should leave Russia to Europe so that America can focus on China, but that is really not happening so far. And, as I mentioned, I think the long-term effects, Henry talked about some of them, with respect to rising food prices, rising energy prices. But I think also what we see is the sort of fracturing of the international system into this divided world order, and the rising protectionism and nationalism that goes along with this is going to bring, I think, unfortunately, more instability, and is going to deal a blow to the prosperity that's been brought about by globalization up to this point for the last several decades. I think it's going to be harder to tackle transnational issues like climate change, unfortunately, because people will be preoccupied with sort of geopolitical contests. And I can't say that I endorse, the foregoing analysis necessarily. My personal view would be that we should focus more on the kinds of cooperative endeavors that we have needed to cooperate on in the past with respect to things like transnational challenges, and try to manage better these geopolitical impulses. But the Russian invasion seems to take us sort of backwards in that respect. So maybe I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. And I'd like to turn, given the the turn of our previous statements from our speakers to Professor Carrie Brown. And I'd like to hear your take on this issue, especially with the mentioned relations between China and Europe.
Great. Thank you very much. It's good to see old friends like Henry and Susan. In fact, I don't think I've actually ever met Susan in person, only virtually. So one day we will actually meet and realize we're not just bots. I'm a real person. But anyway, it's good to see you all. But I'll just say a couple of things broader maybe than just about the very serious situation between Russia and Ukraine at the moment. And I guess just a kind of note of skepticism. Firstly, I don't think that US interests and European interests are naturally aligned. I mean, historically, they haven't been. And I think with the search for autonomy, strategic autonomy, which President Macron has talked about a lot and other European leaders, I mean, that does mean at some points that there's going to be misalignment. And with the American domestic political situation, as I see it, being very hard to predict, very divided, with the potential, kind of return of maybe Trump for a second term in a couple of years' time, there's a lot of instability, not just in our relations, European relations amongst ourselves, but also, and with Russia, and with China, but with Europe, but with America, sorry. So that's the first big problem. We have got to start thinking for ourselves. And that means some fundamental rethinking of what our strategic and security alliances are, without undermining the enormous importance of our links with the United States, but also realizing that we shouldn't just assume that they're absolutely aligned. The second is the first speaker, Signorina Del Papa, referred to China's intentions. I mean, I don't know what China's intentions are. I mean, I don't think China's intentions are as hard as wanting to remake the global system in such a kind of ambitious way. I think China's intentions are fairly self-interested, and that's problematic because China is big and getting bigger economically, unless current economic problems are very deep. But that's not the same as saying that it has some overtly aggressive intention to, remake global order in its own interests, where we're just going to have to march behind it. That would make things a bit simpler. If it was like that, if it was a power like that, maybe a power a bit like Russia, okay, we could kind of basically just mirror it and push back. But I think it's more complicated. And I don't know whether there is really, within European leaders, a consensus on what kind of problem China is, a more aggressive intention, or maybe a more self-interested and problematic intention. But either way, until we get consensus on that issue, I think it's going to be difficult. The third thing is on values, the V word. I mean, I was hunting around the other day for a declaration of European values. I thought it was going to be in the Constitution, but of course the Constitution was never passed. And my old boss at the Foreign Office, Lord John Kernow, was the person who drafted that Constitution in the 2000s. That was never passed, it was never ratified. So where is the statement of our values? I guess for Europeans and for Americans, we're going to have to illustrate our values in the way we behave. And our biggest problem in our dialogue with China is, over the last 20 years, our behavior has not been a great advert. In Afghanistan, in the Middle East, in many other areas, European and American values have been hard to understand. And so when China sees where we have suddenly acquired a very powerful, forceful voice on our values with Russia and Ukraine, and it is right to condemn Russia's appalling behavior in Ukraine, I think it's just very, very unwilling to go deeper in a relationship with, I think, people it just doesn't really trust, because it doesn't think that we do what we say. We're all talk. We're often not really carrying out what we do. So I think we've got to really, if we're talking about values, we've got to be really specific and know that those values work and be carried into practice. Finally, on dialogue, I don't think it's an issue of us having dialogue with China. We have no choice. Europeans definitely have no choice in very important areas. We are heading into economic issues now, which are going to be profound, maybe a recession, maybe even worse. energy costs going through the roof, massive, massive challenges. UK in particular is unlikely to have very good growth, if any growth at all, in the next 2 quarters. And I think in Europe, although it's slightly better, it's still very, very worrying. And, we have to remember the economic position of Europe, which is in recession, is going to be quite different. Political position of Europe in recession is going to be quite different than, Europe, which is, as in the recent past, sort of doing okay. Our domestic politics are going to be quite different as we go through this very challenging time. And I don't think a dialogue with China, which is not going to be led by, first of all, reciprocity and second, recognition, is going to work. I could not stress more Chinese partners, and Henry can maybe kind of correct me on this. I really don't think that they're interested in having dialogue where they are spoken to like they're the junior member now. They're not interested in dialogue where they are being lectured on issues which we care about deeply, like Xinjiang and Hong Kong and Taiwan, for sure. These are important issues. But if you get the tone wrong, and if you start talking to China in a kind of way where there is not recognition and reciprocity, I don't think we're going to get very far with that dialogue. And we have to, I guess the final thing I'll say is recognize in really important areas now, more than ever before, whether we like it or not, our relations with China are going to have to be at least pragmatic and workable. And we're going to have to radically rethink our historic approach. We are not dealing with a junior partner now. We are working into an age where in many areas, China may well be our equivalent, or in many areas, in fact, superior in technology and other areas, which wasn't the case in the past. And we, our politicians and our political elites, are going to have to really rethink the way they look at this relationship, because the idea of like telling China what we're not happy about and that's going to be okay, I just don't think is going to work anymore. So I think tone, although it's a simple thing, is going to be really, really important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Brown. And thank you to all the speakers for this round of statements. You've given us a lot to think about. And I'd like to quickly follow up on this line and asking your opinion, your expectations for China's growing activism abroad. Some people have been discussing China as a future security agent with the war in Ukraine, but I think that what has actually come under the lens is China's more active involvement in foreign policy. Professor Thornton, would you like to kick us off on this?
I think this is an area that people have gotten a little bit hyperventilating about. Frankly, my expectations for China's overseas involvement in security contingencies is, my expectations on that are pretty in check. Whether we're talking about efforts to mediate and settle conflicts in, faraway places, civil wars or whatever, or whether we're talking about some kind of Chinese security force intervention. I think that China has shown a lot of tentativeness about this kind of thing, and I don't think that it should be the highest sort of priority or expectation that we have in the West. I mean, I have, in my time working on China, seen that it's quite preoccupied with major internal challenges, and I think that will likely continue. It's been reluctant to get involved deeply in other countries' security challenges, and we see this actually currently in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Some countries have tried to entice China or propose to China or appeal to China to have a mediating role. And that has, not even Henry, I think, actually wrote an article saying that would be a role that China might take. But we haven't seen that up to now. And I think some of China's experiences in this area, in the Obama administration in the US, for example, we worked hard to get China to contribute in this area. Some of those experiences probably give China some pause. For example, China was the main peacekeeping contingent in the South Sudan after the Sudanese civil war and the establishment of the country of South Sudan. And, several Chinese peacekeepers were killed there. We've seen China's reluctance to be involved even in a country right on its border, Myanmar, in the recent civil strife there. So I think, there are some exceptions to this reticence and reluctance, places where China's clear, territorial interests are involved, like territorial disputes. We certainly would expect that, that Chinese security interests would be invoked, and we might see them be involved there. But I think also we should remember that in places like the Solomon Islands, one of the things that's at issues is something that is a very core interest for China and very important to the Chinese government and the Chinese people, which is the issue of whether a country recognizes the People's Republic of China or whether it recognizes Taiwan. And in the case of the Solomon Islands, we shouldn't forget that this is directly at issue, with the Solomon Islands having switched back and forth between recognition of China or Taiwan, People's Republic of China or Taiwan in the recent period. So, I think that is the kind of thing that, of course, we can't dismiss China's involvement in those kinds of issues, but there's a reason that's very core to China's national interests where we see that happening. And I think in other areas, I'm less worried that we're going to see a very overt, aggressive kind of involvement in security issues around the world.
Thank you very much, Professor. Professor Brown, would you like to contribute on this point?
Yeah, no, I would agree. The Russia-Ukraine conflict, I guess, has shown that were China to be a power with a huge desire to kind of wade in to security issues, this is the chance, right? It's meant to be the only country with a big influence over Russia. And so I guess if it wanted to really show who's running the world, it would use this moment to do it. And it obviously hasn't. It's been very, very reluctant to do anything, kind of beyond expressing soft support for Russia's, kind of abstract rights. Although, as Henry said earlier, I don't think it's likely to be very happy about what's happening with Ukraine, just because it's very destabilizing economically, geopolitically. And China has interest in Ukraine. So I don't see this as being a moment when we're suddenly seeing this interventionist power going around the world and doing things with the Belt and Road and then these other initiatives that it started with. I think there's lots of challenges that it's faced, and I guess it's likely to probably be quite cautious. In the last 15 years, whenever people have leapt up and down and said China's suddenly becoming the new colonizer in Africa or, kind of becoming this sort of great new international force, usually what we've seen is a lot of cautiousness afterwards. Under Xi Jinping, I guess it's become rhetorically more forceful, but I don't think it's got any less reason to be very cautious of wanting to avoid the kind of huge responsibilities that America has at the moment, and that America may will no longer wish to kind of shoulder as China's economy gets potentially bigger.
Thank you very much, Professor Brown. Before leaving the floor to Professor Wang, I think you have a lot of issues to tackle with your next speech. I wanted to throw in for you a question that has actually emerged from the audience. One of the members of our audience is particularly interesting to hear your opinion on China's activism towards Africa in this sense. So if you can bundle all the answer up in a single statement, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Julia. Yeah, no, I share a lot of comment, Susan and Carrie made. I think that China, from what I can see, is really wants to maintain the existing global order, which China has benefited enormously. This order set up by the US and West countries after the Second World War. And China is an active participant of that. And China actually now get more active into that now. As Susan mentioned, that China is actively engaged in the peacekeeping forces. Actually, the total peacekeeping force China sent is equal to the all other four members combined. So what China is hoping now is that to maintain that and call for multilateral order that enshrined in the UN Charter and also in the UN system. So that is, I think, is still the policy that China still wants to have. So probably now we are after 77, 78 years of a Bretton Woods moment, and now it's time after the pandemic, after the Ukraine war, when we have to really uphold and upgrade the current global system. We're also giving China some recognition. And China has practiced this AIB, which is also a good example of multilateral system, and Italian is a member as well of AIB, and also Italian used to be also a member of a Belt and Road country, signing country as well. So we hope that China can upgrade that with the global system that is adaptable to every countries. Like AIB could be a good model to expand on that, and also on African. I think China is helping African, and China has a China-African Economic Cooperation conference every 2 years. I see that there's a lot of similarities because China is also just getting out of poverty for many of its own population, and also the infrastructure experience, the urbanization experience, the education experience, and all those things. Probably China can offer a lot of help to African countries. So certainly. There's a lot of cooperation that we can see, but really, I think that we should really, China, US, EU, we should work on this global system that has been there for 78 years. This UN establishment, and it's representing the multilateral WHO, WTO, and IMF, and World Bank, and ADB, AIB, and all those things. So probably it's really great. Like I was talking to Larry Summers just not too long ago. He was saying the World Bank should be replenished with more capital and revitalized. And why not all the development banks work together to stimulate the infrastructure, even after post-Ukraine war, and we should have a new Marshall Plan and work. Let's find common things to work together, rather than we're obsessed with geopolitical differences. So that would be my final comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. And I'd like to pose to the whole panel another question that actually emerged from our audience. The member of our audience actually has been asking for a discussion on what she or he defines as China's outreach. And actually bridging to the opening remarks of Giuliana Del Papa, I would like to hear your thoughts about what is the future of China's soft power as a reputation building tool after the war in Ukraine, in just like, unfortunately, 2 or 3 minutes, because our time is almost up. Professor Brown, would you like to start, maybe?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, of course. The future of China's soft power as a reputation building tool after the war in Ukraine.
I don't know what soft power means. I have no clue what soft power means. I think it's a kind of fairy tale, kind of phrase used. And so, I mean, it's got influence. And I mean, the fact is that, because it's in 20 years, it's increased its economic size 5 times. It just means that whether it likes it or not, it's got to use that influence. It's doing things is a problem, but it not doing things is also a problem. I mean, that's the kind of quandary. That's the problem. That's the contradiction. China doesn't have any choice. If it wanted to just do nothing, everyone would be worried. Why is this huge power doing nothing? That's kind of what it did in the Hu Jintao era. When it does things, that's a problem because everyone, obviously is worried about what it's doing. I don't think it believes in soft power anymore. I think that kind of phase is gone. I think it's trying to target maybe particular communities to talk to. And I mean, that's expected. And I don't believe in this myth of the hidden hand, China trying to influence political elites. It's probably frustrated, and it's probably quite frustrating what it does. But I don't think that it's particularly strange that a power that's grown so quickly and it is different politically to so many others is causing itself and others such huge problems.
Thank you very much. Professor Wang, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the things I can certainly see is China now offers some economic stability now to the world. China become magnetic for the world economy. And for example, last year, China's import-export has gone up 30%, even during the pandemic. China is supplying the whole world now. And also with growing China middle-class market, we're having 400 million, probably going to have a 500 million, 600 million down the road. And that is biggest market for the world. So I think that is probably one of the key China's impact, if not soft power for the world to really to intertwine. And also another thing I would like to emphasize that I hope that after pandemic, I really hope the world can come back to China to see, because everything seems working. China has all the high-speed railway, 5 million 5G, 4G stations. Everything works perfect here. And also 1 billion people under the social security, 1.3 million billion people under some kind of medical security. China is really, is now what used to be with 280 million among its population with college degrees. Every year graduates about 12 million college graduates. So that would be a new talent pool for the world. And also, China provide one of the biggest impact probably is before the pandemic, China has 150 million people traveling around the world outside China. That kind of a purchasing and people-to-people exchanges and student. China is the largest student sending country. So all those things probably can really bring China economically and socially, culturally intertwined with other countries, so that we don't really, after separation for too long, we really get too deep into our this argument and really get things out of control. Yeah, I hope that we will soon see the end of this isolation.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. Professor Thornton, I'm leaving the last word to you on this point.
Yeah, well, I kind of agree with Carrie that we shouldn't really think about soft power. We should think about influence. And what I think I see is that China's influence comes through its efforts in the economics and development area mostly. And for the US, our influence is coming through sort of cultural, but also especially increasingly lately through our security commitments and our security architecture. And if you think about what happened in the last Cold War, and I hope we won't enter a new Cold War, but it was exactly the reverse. The U.S. sort of and its allies focused on sort of culture, but also especially economic development, innovation, technology, whereas the Soviet Union focused on building its military. And I don't know if this current dynamic that we have going, where China's focused on economics and we're less so, at least as far as our open, engaged trade policy and other sort of openness in the economic realm seems to be retrenching. If that's gonna be a good combination for Western countries over the long term in this competition, I certainly think that there's a lot of overlap between what China hopes for in the international system and what we all hope for. And I wish we would focus more on that and less on this kind of dividing approach to the world.
Thank you very much, Professor Thornton. I thank all the speakers, Professor Carrie Brown from the Lao China Institute at King's College, Professor Thornton from Yale Law School, and Professor Wang from the Center for China and Globalization. I thank you all, and I invite the audience to remain connected with our conference for the second panel moderated by Filippo Fasulo.
Thank you so much, Julia. Actually, it was very interesting discussion. We hope to be, and I hope we will be as interesting as you were in the first panel. We discussed about strategic issues issue in the first part. Now we will try to focus on the economic dimension of the strategic competition. So there are a few key words, like for example, decoupling, deglobalization, and new policies, new initiatives like the Indo-Pacific economic framework, which is brand new, actually, just a couple of weeks. Let's stay a little bit with decoupling. Decoupling actually is a term that was supposed to be quite new, and just few experts just knew it in 2018, but after the trade war, it became well known all around the world. In 2019, it was already one of the word of the year, according to Financial Times. But still, in 2019, the idea that we can decouple the Western economy, the US economy, to the Chinese economy appeared to be something quite strange, just something on paper, but nothing could happen on reality. But after the pandemic and after the war in Ukraine, maybe this word, this concept, this decoupling might be, I will ask you quite soon, I will ask you to Alicia Garcia-Herrero, Xiumin Qi, and Joshua Meltzer, it might be something more real and something that can really happen. And decoupling, of course, is connected to the idea of deglobalization. We talked about in the previous panel about cooperation, how to deal with China and how maybe to keep a door open to cooperation. And economy used to be the most important realm for cooperation. But now, at this time, when we can see ideological competition getting strong day by day, now we don't know at this point if economy is safe from ideological competition, or if we should review our idea of globalization, focusing on a globalization that is not only based on economic relationships, but also on political issues and on strategic affairs. So let's start with this panel. Let's start with the first question. The first question is if, according to you, this economic decoupling is real, is something that really can happen, or is it just something we keep saying each other in seminars like this one, or is something they can really foresee in the future? And so if the globalization as we knew it is already over or not, and how it might change, or is it just a simplistic exaggeration, just as said, and I'm joking, just to be here and to have some time together to discuss. So let's start with Alicia Garcia-Herrera. What do you think about it?
Well, I would love decoupling just to be, a conversation, because that would be less dangerous for the global economy. But I do think it's happening. And in fact, I still remember dissecting the word decoupling, starting with where it originated, which is actually an engineering concept coming from tight coupling. And why do I say this? It's because we need to realize that the degree of tight coupling, i.e. the degree of codependence of economies in the East and the West has never been as high, not even during Japan's time of booming economy, which, at some point was actually only for a few days. And at that time, I still remember, because I was living in Italy, bigger than the US. And this is because the yen was so strong. So point is, we have been at a point of huge coupling, tight coupling, and it is actually not so abnormal to think of some sort of decoupling. Some people prefer to use the word bifurcation. Why? Because it's not so much about a disruption, but rather than you start separating your future. It's about the flow, not the stock, if you see what I mean. So think about investment. We may keep the investment we have in China, but we might not invest further. So it's kind of, you keep what you have, but you diversify for future investment. And I think that's the way I would kind of redefine the word decoupling. Some examples of why I do think this is happening. Well, on trade, and this is perhaps more fragmentation than decoupling, because it's happening also for other regions, not only China, US. we're seeing a shortening of global value chains. There's a lot of data, input output data showing that, and it's not new. And actually, it's even natural. It's not only about rivalry. Part of that might be explained even by, our fight for climate change, that we think that transportation costs should be reduced. And there's many other reasons. So it's not only because of rivalry. I want to insist on this. The other type of quote unquote decoupling we're seeing increasingly is financial decoupling. I'm actually more worried about financial decoupling than trade decoupling, because financial decoupling can be slightly more abrupt than trade, or, which I've not yet mentioned, technology. For technologies, people like to talk about bifurcation, meaning starting to diverge over time rather than immediate stop of a certain technology, because diffusion of technology is actually hard to stop. So that's why people talk about bifurcation. So financial decoupling, why do I worry? Because, and we're seeing it, I can give you many examples, IPOs, Chinese listings in the US, sanctions, all of these are images of financial decoupling. I think financial decoupling is worrisome because it gets to the heart of our international monetary system, which is basically the reserve currency role of the dollar. And I think that can be extremely, extremely costly if it were to get in trouble all of a sudden. We could even talk about other types of decoupling, but I know I'm running out of time. We could even think of education, people-to-people movement. That's where we are. We still have closed borders in the world, as we all know. And I think that's a signal of a new era. Because movement of people, including business people, tourists, students, is starting to, after 2.5 years, to be much more, it's heavier and harder, and it requires much more effort from those who want to engage in either education or, leisure or business. So I do worry about this. I think, not that we will be in the Cold War, that's not what I think I envisage, but the seamless codependence where things were easy and efficient, I don't think it's going to come back anytime soon. So that's all from my side.
Thank you, Alicia Garcia Herrero. This is quite interesting actually. So something that we are really experiencing. So that's true according to your point of view. And so let's see, maybe from the American point of view, from Joshua Meltzer from Brookings Institute. What can you tell us about that? So do you think the decoupling is happening, is here, and how this impact on globalization towards something we can call deglobalization? Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Filippo, and it's great to be here, and it's great to be amongst these excellent panelists. Very timely event. I largely agree with Alicia's framing of the issues. I might go a little bit further in terms of prognostication. I do think we're in a slightly more challenging space potentially, and I will refer to a Cold War analogy. But what I do think is happening at the moment is there is a lot of discussion about decoupling. There's a lot of policy initiatives that are being seriously looked at, not only in the US, but in China, in Europe and elsewhere. And then at the same time, there's an economic reality on the ground, and there is a somewhat of a disconnect between the two at the moment. So one of the questions is what's going to happen going forward? And I'll provide you a bit of a US perspective on this. I do think that broadly, to frame the issue, that the period of sort of multilateral globalization that came after the fall of the Berlin Wall is over, in the sense that we're going to have a kind of multilateral economic framework embedded in the WTO on an MFN basis. I think that is unfortunately probably a thing of the past. We have a ministerial meeting going on underway at the WTO at the moment. So hopefully we'll get some outcomes there. But irrespective, I think that agenda around big trade kind of rounds and making progress multilaterally on trade and economic integration is finished. I think the peace dividend that came from the end of the Berlin Wall, the ability to focus on trade and economic issues, issues on building social goods and not having to focus so much on military is over. I think we're going to see increases in military budgets globally. And I think what's also going to happen is we're going to see an increased securitization of economic and trade policy. And in that respect, it's not unlike what was preceded the fall of the Berlin Wall during the Cold War, when essentially security policy drove a lot of trade and economic integration. And to some extent, I think that's going to be the opportunity and the challenge. I think there's going to be renewed opportunity for deeper economic integration amongst countries that are allied on a security perspective. And I think that the challenge is going to be to try to make sure that the security aspect doesn't overtake and imbalance the trade and economic approach to globalization. So finding that balance is going to be key. The important difference, of course, to bring this back to China, which is what the theme of this discussion is about, is that China is not Russia. And so it's very unlike the Cold War in that respect. China is clearly deeply integrated into the global economy. So what does economic relations with China look like, given, I think, this new framing going forward? I think, Alicia mentioned technology, and I think technology is at the heart of this issue. Technology is one area where the United States, Europe, Japan, South Korea, other allies, the West essentially, still are largely world leaders and maintain control over a lot of those technologies, whether it's semiconductors or high precision manufacturing and so forth. And it is there that there is a genuine choke point, which gives the US and allies sort of leverage in an economic sense. And that's been made clear, I think, in part during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the impact of the sanctions and the access to technology has completely been a key reason that a lot of their airline is not moving forward. Their car manufacturing, even their military, has been significantly degraded. It's also clearly been a key centerpiece of what's been happening between the United States and China, access to technology. And I think will continue to be so. But before I get into that, let me just, though, talk to you what's happening on the US-China economic relationship, because despite the Trump years of 25% tariffs on Chinese imports and similar tariffs that China has placed on US exports, US-China trade is actually 50% higher today than it was in 2016. And so despite these tariffs, we've seen higher and higher levels of trade. Interestingly, China's current account surplus which had declined quite considerably to almost zero in 2018, is now back to a level we haven't seen in about a decade, about 1.8% of GDP. I think it speaks to some challenges in the Chinese economy more than anything else, but it underscores still the dependence of China, I think, on exports and trade, and the fact that the US and China remain deeply integrated on an economic basis. So the challenge, I think, from a globalization decoupling perspective is going to be what trade continues and what trade do we consider too sensitive to, that we need to put some boundaries around. And this is, I think, the really big challenge. So we see in the United States, for instance, there's been this effort to place export restrictions on sort of foundational and critical technologies. This has been an ongoing process. It's been very hard to define what they are, but I think that gets to the core at what do we think that we can sort of export comfortably, and what do we think that there need to be controls over in case they're going to be used for national and defense purposes by third countries. But in order to be effective, it also requires cooperation with allies. A lot of allies produce similar technologies, and so for the US to do this on its own simply undermines its own industry and doesn't achieve the policy goals of preventing access to these technologies. So we've seen very good cooperation with Europe, with Japan, Australia and others around trying to define out these kind of export restrictions. Investment restrictions as well have been a particularly important part. Again, not specifically aimed at China, but aimed at trying to control access to core technologies and so forth. So we have, as a result, seen very significant declines in investment. Chinese investment into the US is down about 75%. US investment in China is down by about 50%. And I think this is Alicia's point, is that companies are invested there. They will continue to remain there. Often it's a very important market, but I think companies are looking, very hard at reinvesting, or new companies that are looking to China. I think the risk profile of investing in China has gone up very significantly. And so I think we can see a lot less investment at this stage and probably a lot less trade as well. final point I'll make is that we've seen that the technology and trade piece has really been the centre point now of international discussions around the next stage of globalisation, whether that's in the Trade and Technology Council, in particular, where technology across a whole range of areas is central. We're seeing that in the Indo-Pacific region, whether it's in the Quad, the US, Australia, India, and Japan, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Digital is a very important part of that, and I will talk about that later. But I think it just underscores the point I'm making that when we think about what does the global economy look like going forward, it's going to be a rebalancing that tries to maintain MFN-style trade amongst the types of goods and services that do not present national security issues. And I think a lot less of that trade in some of the technology areas where the national security issues are acute. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We will be back later on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. I think it's quite interesting. So it's very interesting if we can deep dive a little bit on it. But first, I want to ask Xiumin Qi his point of view on this debate on decoupling, because as our previous guest said, decoupling is either a policy from US or for China, there is a huge debate about that, or a reality experiencing right now. So, Professor Xiumin Qi, what's your view on it? And is globalization really in a problematic situation or not? Please, the floor is yours. We cannot hear you quite well. Sorry, Professor. We just Yes, now we can hear you. Please. No, sorry. Of course, whenever we do this kind of this, when you say, "Can you hear me?" we can hear you. Whenever you start talking, it stops going on. So it's just a little problem. There is a small decoupling from your voice, but we will be back soon. So I asked my colleague if they fix it in a second. And yes, and we can just maybe stay on in line with the discussion. And so staying again with Joshua Meltzer. So again, I come back with you asking if you can say a few words on this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. So there is a new project just presented by Joe Biden during his trip to Asia last few weeks. No, Professor, no, still not going. So I asked my colleague to check it again and stay with Professor Meltzer. If you can say something more about this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. So moving from the idea of seeing decoupling as a reality, and maybe to try to organize a bloc on containing China. Is it true or not? How can you see it?
Yeah. So. Just quickly on the Indo-Pacific Framework, and then let me cycle back to a little bit of context, which I think is important. So the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework was launched, last month. It is comprised of, well, it's got 12. I think it's actually got 14 nations now. Fiji joined, but essentially it's 12, 14 countries across the Indo-Pacific. Usefully, it's got a range of developed countries which are typically very eager to be on board these types of trade initiatives, like Japan, Australia, Singapore, but also I think 7 of the 10 ASEAN countries are on board, including Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, and importantly as well as India. There's not really an Indo-Pacific in a sense without India. India has traditionally been reluctant, to say the least, on trade. They essentially didn't join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership at the end, which they'd spent years negotiating. And so there's a lot of skepticism, I think, in the US about the wisdom of bringing India on board. But I think strategically it made a lot of sense. It's also the case that one of the elements, the IPEF has got 4 sort of pillars, one around what they call fair and resilient trade. The other is around supply chain resilience. The third is around infrastructure and clean energy. And the fourth around tax and anti-corruption. Let me just focus on the trade component. There's no quote market access in that the US has proposed that we're not going to be doing tariff reductions as you would normally do in a free trade agreement negotiation. Counters that with the observation that there is nevertheless market access that will eventuate. So, for instance, strong outcomes on trade facilitation can improve the movement of goods across borders. Outcomes on data flows in a digital context, part of the IPF, it certainly can improve market access for digital services and other products that are traded. So there are elements of market access, even though it may not be tariff focused. And this in part reflects really the administration's assessment of the challenges of getting a traditional trade agreement through Congress. And so this is the other element of IPF, which is it's going to be done as an executive agreement rather than a treaty, which means that it does not require a congressional approval. It doesn't require trade promotion authority. And this gives the administration some flexibility to move more quickly. It limits what it can do because at some point, things like tariff reductions need to go back to Congress, so it can't do tariff reductions. But the risks, I think, from the perspective of other partners in the region, is that executive agreements, while easier to do, are easier to undo. And I think the last 4 years of the Trump administration are a real shadow over IPF because of the rapid withdrawal of the Trump administration from the TPP, which ultimately was reconstituted as a CPTPP. But that's sort of, this is now the key vehicle that the Biden administration has identified for trying to reshape economic integration in the region. This is certainly not about containing China. It's clearly not about containing China. Just when you look at the scope of US-China economic relations, and it's not about containing China when you look at the importance of China as an export market for almost all countries in the Indo-Pacific region. China is the largest export market for most countries in the region, and that is not something that anyone is asking anyone to walk back from or to jeopardize. So it is very much not.
Yes. Now,
not about that, but it is about.
I can hear you very clearly.
Yeah, we can hear Professor Shumichi, so we can just hear. So, Professor Meltzer.
Let me just check it. Let me try again.
Okay. So just some connection.
Okay.
Would you like me to continue?
Please, you can go.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you, Professor. We can hear
No.
you. Thank you. We'll be back. We will back to you in a second.
You cannot hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Can I speak now?
1 second. Professor Joshua Meltzer end his speech, and I come back to you. Thank you.
Okay.
Please.
Okay. No, I'll be brief. I mean, it is not about containing China, but it is about setting up the next level of rules and engagement in the region, new rules around digital trade, new rules around supply chain resiliency, clean energy, and so forth. And one would expect that these new rules, if they succeed, now that if they are open, would be open broadly to participation by China and others. And so it's shaping the strategic and economic context in the Indo-Pacific in a potentially open and interoperable way, rather than seeking to exclude China from that. But at the moment, it makes a lot of sense for the US to be working with this subset of countries to develop those rules and norms initially. I'll stop there and let the professor come.
Thank you so much. Professor Shumichi,
Okay.
Here we are.
Okay, now you can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry. I don't know why. We are talking about these so-called decoupling. I think this is US policy. Try to decouple China first from trade, production chain, supply chain, the so-called reindustrialization, even during the Obama administration and Trump administration, but it was not quite successful. Now I think decoupling basically is in the high-tech industry. Because of the Ukraine war, now the concern and worries about this so-called strategic security, issue, and also geopolitical issue will push some of the high-tech company try to suspend their investment or their supply chain here in China. And I think U.S. Indo-Pacific economic framework basically trying to, arrange these ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian countries, and India to host what they try to shift these high-tech, supply chain from China to these countries. Problem is that whether these countries have the proper, better, soft and hard infrastructure to host these investments. We'll have to wait and see. Anyway, I think decoupling, because of these geopolitical and security concern, will push some of the sensitive high-tech industry, from China, already from Russia, then I think from China to the so-called like-minded countries in Indo-Pacific countries. So in this sense, decoupling will happen slowly. But as what I've already mentioned, that decouple from China in all the economic contact, especially ordinary industries, investments, production chain, and supply chain, there is not really going to happen because the interdependence is so high, and the economic, cost for decouple from China is very high. So I don't think that is really to for these multinational corporations or for the policymakers, both in US and in Europe, will really push these overall, economic contact, trade, investment, with China, because the cost will be very high. Only the so-called high-tech, sensitive industries may, become decoupled from China, and it's going to cause a little bit more difficulties for China to, trying to learn the high technology through these trade investment from West countries. But I think China, policymaker, is already trying to push domestic, own investment in these high tech industries, and more innovation and intervention. I think this regard is going to have some negative impact on the Chinese economic development, especially this high-tech economic industries development. And these are, to me, acceptable ordinary competition. And it's not a big problem. Main problem is what I worry is the so-called financial decoupling. Because these financial sanctions against Russia, potentially against China and some other non-Western countries, will damage existing international financial system. And US dollars key international currency position in the international economic arena. And this, undermine not only, developing countries or non-Western countries, but also in turn will have very negative impact on US and Europe as well. And this will push China and some other non-Western countries, even to some extent India, to think to use more bilateral and regional arrangement to establish regional payment system and trading between them on the contract base, not on the free currency payment basis. And in turn, this is going to damage the whole world economy. And so I think this we should try to prevent and to make the international norm in this regard, not to weaponize US dollar, weaponize the international financial system against other countries. Look at this sanction against Russia. It is going to cause huge damage, both on Russia and the rest of the world. And we are facing huge, inflation and hyperinflation, both in energy, petroleum, and grain. Not only Russia, not only Europe suffer, China also suffer.
Thank you.
Biggest, importing country, both in energy and grain, and it's going to cost China, I think, paying something around 200 to 300 billion US dollar a year for that.
Thank you, Professor.
So I will stop here.